Hi, it's Dr. Lynette, and I hope you're doing well. So I do like to send a video feedback. If that isn't workable for you, please let me know. In terms of APA formatting, you have to, of course, check with your chair, but I can see a couple of issues that you may want to make sure of. So you have too much space in between sections. So everything in APA is double spaced. That's APA requirement. Now your school may have, some additional direction. And so this space here between the end of the sentence and the beginning of your next section is too large. It should be double spaced, which technically it would look like that. But if your chair wants that extra gap or your program wants that extra spacing between sections, you have to go with what they say. The other thing I see, and again, as I'm noted for you in the email, my first hour of review is free of charge. The other thing is a structural element. It sort of leans into APA also in terms of how dissertations are typically presented. We always have for chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, we have like an introduction. Some chairs may want you to restate your problem or your focus element in that introduction, especially for like chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4. And then we also have at the end of the chapter a paragraph, and a paragraph is typically 3 or more sentences in APA or in academic writing. At the end of the chapter, we have a brief summary without restating or copy pasting anything above, and we also have a preview of the next chapter. And so one of the things you might want to look at is some of your dissertations at your institution that have already been completed and signed off on, such as past graduates. Another tip that I often tell my students, and I did myself, if your chair, assuming your chair is experienced, which typically most of them are, meaning they've done other dissertations, they've worked with other students, you want to look at, if you can find that information easily, you want to see what their other students were and look at their dissertations. But you are missing, you have a conclusion. Looks like you have a conclusion, but I'm not sure why it's in that area. Or maybe this is a different chapter. I thought this was all chapter 1. So I apologize if that is not the case. I'm sorry, I thought all of this was chapter 2. Because I see the conclusion here, and then you have additional. Oh, this is your problem of practice. Okay. I thought this was your dissertation, chapter 2. So those are, in my mind, two different things. But if this was a chapter 2, you would have your conclusion at the end, which would be here after your definitions. I don't see any major issues with paragraph construction. You seem to have good paragraph construction. One thing you want to think about, I did notice, I'll see if I can find it here real quick. There's something called the meal plan, and I can send that link to you in the email, that we don't end a paragraph with someone else's work. We have to perhaps have an introductory, each paragraph stands on its own. We have an introductory sentence within the paragraph that identifies what we're going to talk about in that paragraph. Then we have our supporting evidence, so to speak, or we provide a comparing and contrasting element, or we talk about a seminal work that relates back to whatever it is that paragraph is about. And that's where we have our citations at, in the middle of the paragraph. And then the end of the paragraph, whether it's 1 sentence, 2 sentences, we either are going to transition to the next paragraph, depending on where we're at within the academic work, or we're going to have our analysis. And so here, for example, you're ending with someone else's information. Now, maybe that makes sense. Sometimes it makes sense depending on how you've constructed your paragraphs and constructed what we call the flow, right? Does this make sense that you're ending with this L. Miki's work from 2021 before you start talking about long-term consequences of disconnected youth? Or do you would it add a little depth to your analysis in your dissertation that you have, something else here? Your own analysis, so to speak, before you start. You're now analyzing what's in this paragraph. But overall, I don't see huge problems. Looks like you have really good paragraph construction, other than what I just mentioned. You are citing correctly. You're providing the information here, the author. One thing is that you are a little out of alignment here. So what I tell students is the author name and the year of publication go together always. If that's all you're citing, because it's not a direct quote, the name and the year. If you're citing a direct quote, which is what you're doing here, you separated the year, you put the year at the end. That's not how we do it in APA. So 2021 would need to go up here. And then you would put the page number like this. You also want to make sure that I don't know if I can check word count. You want to make sure that your direct quotes, if they are in this format, that they are less than 40 words, which you're at 33. Because if it's 40 words or more for your direct quote, you have to present it in a different way. It's called a block presentation. It's different. This here you might want to double check. This is not a heading format within APA. We don't italicize and center. We can italicize within APA. There's something that you could do like this. That would be correct if that's something you want to do. There's different levels of headers. There's, I think, 4 levels of headers within APA that you control as the author of the work. But the way that you had it was not one of those options. Oops. So I want to make sure I go back because I don't want to make changes to your Google Doc. I should have probably downloaded this. Sorry about that. I don't want to make changes to your Google Doc. Also, APA does not allow for anything in the header other than the page number for a student submission. So again, I'm just giving you the APA, element. So it seems like from what I'm seeing, you have some formatting issues, which is not uncommon. Formatting in APA can be challenging. The work, unfortunately, you have to do is see what your program and your chair wants. Because sometimes they're like, just follow APA. And then when you do, they're like, well, I don't want it like that. Or conversely, they'll say, oh yeah, follow APA, except I want extra space between sections. Or I want the margins different. For my doctoral program, we had to increase our right margin. It had to be 1.5 inches for our dissertation. I don't know what type of study you are doing, but I would guesstimate based on what I'm seeing. In terms of your writing, you have a little bit of a flow issue, as I mentioned about the meal plan situation. But I would guesstimate you're definitely going to be under 7 hours of time. So $700. Well, you actually got an hour, so I would say maybe $600 max. But that would be on the high end. It could be even less than that. A good cost-saving method I can offer to you is that you send me, when you get to that point, you send me your completed, so to speak, draft of chapter 2. You may have other elements ready. You may have chapters 3 and 4 done. In chapter 1, typically writing a dissertation, we start with chapter 2. But you have, based on what your chair has told you, you have a good chapter 2 ready to go. And you are now moving on to chapter 3 and chapter 4. And typically in the process, you end up going back to chapter 2 after you complete 3 and 4 and perhaps part of 5. And you make any tweaks in terms of adding content if needed to chapter 2, meaning you look at additional literature pieces or you do additional research. But if you send me your chapter 2 and that's the only good draft that I look at, and I make my recommendations, and then you implement those in terms of format, paragraph construction, etc. And then the last thing I look at is your complete dissertation, meaning all of your chapters and your reference list, because often there's a lot of editing that perhaps could help you have a very clean submission to be published for your citations. There's a lot of nuances. There's, some general rules in terms of full citation formatting, but sometimes we miss those things. We all do it because we're, typically you have, pages and pages of full citations. So those 2 reviews, meaning I'm only doing perhaps 3 hours max. I'm only looking at chapter 2 and perhaps your whole dissertation and your full citation listing, and making sure those things are in alignment with APA in terms of format and style. And then I can provide you, say, well, why don't you look at chapter 3, page 25 or page 65, whatever it is, and say, this paragraph needs a little bit more to it, perhaps. But anything I tell you about content, like maybe you need to reconstruct this paragraph, or maybe, you talk about this particular concept, but it's not crystal clear what it is you're trying to say. Those are really up to you to implement or not. I'm not your chair, so you have to meet their expectations and their requirements. If they're okay with the paragraph, leave it like it is. But if they don't say anything about it and you want to add to it, make sure it's okay with them. But what I can tell you is this is how APA would cite this work, right? Versus how you perhaps may have presented it. And then, typically chairs will say, okay, change it, but they are the gatekeeper for this process. And so anything I say to you is a suggestion, is not a mandate. But based on what I'm seeing, I would say you're going to be potentially on the lower end. But you want to pay attention to, when you get into writing your actual chapters, you want to pay attention to APA, which requires double spacing in between lines. Also, APA would not necessarily support this unless this is an image. If this is an image that you pulled from somewhere, then you would need to cite it. But in this case, if this is your hand typing out, or you're creating this organizational mission and this organizational performance goal, then it should be double spaced and it should not be in a bold font. Bold font is specifically used within APA when we are writing it as the author. The only exception to that we would add bold font would be as if it's in an image that we are pulling from another resource and putting it in our work, and they have the bold font already there, then we would leave it. We wouldn't change it. But all images also would need to be cited appropriately and identified. You have to say image 1, and then you have to have a citation below. So that is my feedback to you at this point. If you would like to move forward, please let me know. I thought you were at the dissertation phase. I'm not sure, but if you are, wherever you are in this process, whether you're at the dissertation phase or whatever work you need, just want to get clarification from you in terms of your timeline. You mentioned the end of March. Perhaps I'm not recalling it correctly, but I thought that was for your dissertation work, and that's fine, but just confirm that because we are at the end of February. So that gives me, maybe a week perhaps to get something back to you, turnaround time. And I do work full time as an educator. So I do need at least 7 days, hopefully. Especially if you're sending me your entire dissertation to look at, meaning chapters 1 through 5. If I am not clear on anything, if you have any questions, please let me know.